Well, last week we looked at how economics textbooks had taught us the law of demand and how it was all wrong, drawing those demand curves on very simple graphs, all just plain wrong. Well, today, the supply curve makes even less sense, if that's possible, for something that makes no sense whatsoever. How can it be any less sense than that? But we'll look at it anyway. So in 2 weeks, we will have pulled apart the first chapter of every school economics textbook. Economists say. That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, last time we looked at the fallacy of the demand curve. It's not a law, we decided. It doesn't always respond to changes in price at the aggregate level anyway, because there are so many other factors to consider. And when you factor in the relationship between workers, capitalists and bankers, the whole theory falls apart. Listen to last week's podcast for more on that. Today, it gets even more exciting. The supply curve and the point at which, and we are going to do both of these today, the supply curve and the point at which the two intercept. I don't think we can separate them out. By the way, Steve, after last week, Mitchell wrote and said, are there any books you can suggest for someone with basic economic understanding, a basic economics background, anything you would suggest to help them understand and improve their overall knowledge? This is in relation to, getting down to the basics that we spoke about last week. Where would you start? If you'd read all those economics textbooks and now you wanted the truth, where would you start, other than obviously debunking economics?
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that one for me. The other one that is really it's 100% critique. The other book I'd recommend is one which was out of print for a hell of a long time by an Australian mathematician called John Blatt. I think I mentioned John Black a couple of times, but I'll give it a background here. He was exposed to economics by being invited along to attend a talk by one other person at the same university he was at, who was also nominated for but didn't get the relevant Nobel Prize. So Blatt was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize in physics. The guy who invited him was nominated once for the Nobel Prize in economics. And when the guy giving the economics talk finished and asked Blatt what he thought, Blatt said, "That is the greatest world of rubbish I have sat through in my entire academic career, and I intend to find there must be something. If that is advanced economics, there's something seriously wrong, and I intend finding out what it is." That's my very bad attempt at an Austrian accent.
Not that we work on stereotypes at all.
Not at all. No, I've got a couple of Austrians in my background that I can actually research if necessary. So he wrote this book called Dynamic Economic Systems, and in my opinion, it is the best ever overview of economics, both critique and putting forward alternatives. And then it went out of print. Well, very luckily, a short while ago, I think it's Routledge, re-released it as a Kindle. So search for John Blatt, B-L-A-T-T, and the book is called Dynamic Economic Systems. And please ignore Amazon's summary that it's about Hong Kong commercial law.
That will have put a few people off.
Yeah, I'm sure it has.
So Blatt is the name to look. That reminds me, by the way, I remember getting in trouble years and years ago at school. I know it was heavily influenced by Spike Milligan, clearly in my early days. We had to write, it was something that would appear on someone's gravestone, just a lesson in creativity. And mine was, "Here lies Reginald Spratt, who ran in front of a bus." Splat. That was for some reason I got in trouble. I thought it was genius. Now, okay, let's look at the supply curve.
Not as good as what is actually on the Spike Milligan's tombstone. You know what that is, don't you?
I told you I was ill. Was that one in his?
That's it. Yeah, I told you I was ill.
And I love the fact that he. What was the town on the Central Coast in New South Wales? Woy Woy, the world's biggest above ground cemetery. We could just spend an hour talking Spike Milligan, couldn't we? In fact, I could.
We could.
There was a baboon who one afternoon decided to ride to the sun. So with I can't remember it now. So with two great palms strapped to his arms, he started his takeoff run. Mile after mile, he galloped in style, but he never once left the ground. "You're going too slow," said a passing crow. "Try reaching the speed of sound." So he put on a spurt. By God, how it hurt. Both of his souls. Now there, I'm losing it now. But there we are. Amazing how it sticks.
I'm going to give you that, ladies and gentlemen. That is completely unscripted and live. Okay, so this is
now. What were we going to talk about?
This is the deep memory bank of Phil Dobbie on Spike Milligan.
What were we going to talk about today? The supply curve.
Supply curve,
which Spike Milligan never wrote about, because he realised it was even for him it was nonsense. But interesting, isn't it? Looking at the supply curve, an example of where maybe it does work is in the oil industry. Given all it takes is a blocked sewers See what I did there? To send
block sewers, well done.
Sending prices rising.
No claps for that one, sorry.
Sending prices rising. So surely that is a case that, we do have this elasticity in supply, where we see this responsiveness in supply. If supply falls, straight away the oil price shoots up. Immediately, not for long, but this is one industry, isn't it? An example where in that industry, prices are completely driven by supply. And that supply obviously is controlled by an oligopoly as well.
Yeah, that's a good example, because I'm going to be trashing the theory of supply as it applies to manufactured goods. But Fallacy, who is really the economist that non-orthodox economists should name themselves after, we decided in a poll on Twitter just recently, made the point that commodity prices like that, where the supply is limited and the stuff, particularly when it's going to decay like in agricultural output, but equally oil, where it has to be available or your cars don't move. The demand, the price will respond very rapidly to a shortage in supply. It's got nothing to do with the marginal cost of getting it out of the ground. The price is far higher than that, but that is demand determined, and the price will vary very radically because the supply can plunge. As we've seen, as soon as that canal is blocked, then no oil gets through from the oil-producing states on the south side to the oil-consuming states on the north side of the Suez Canal, and the price goes up through the roof. So and also a higher supply will encourage a higher price will encourage a higher level of supply. In that sense, an upward sloping supply curve for oil makes plenty of sense.
But you said it there, didn't you? You mentioned, the margin. So the supply curve in the economics textbooks, the quantity produced on the x-axis, we've got the price on the y-axis. The law says the higher the price, the more producers will want to supply higher quantities to the market to make more money. But is it the price or is it the margin on that product, which obviously is a very different thing?
Well, it comes down to this whole word marginal, and economics. The actually neoclassical economists were originally described as, quote unquote, the marginalists, and they say everything happens on the margin. And if you read Greg Mankiw's brilliantly exciting literary wonder called the Microeconomics, the textbook of microeconomics, which I read occasionally when I can't get to sleep fast enough. It says that economists know that everything is calculated at the margin. So on the demand curve, which we trashed in the last podcast, that's supposed to be the marginal benefit of consuming a commodity, and the marginal benefit falls as the quantity consumed rises, whereas the supply curve is literally supposed to be the marginal cost curve. And this is supposed marginal cost is, it's not that you have to offer a higher price to induce suppliers to supply more to the market, and their margin, the profit margin, goes up as a result. It's literally it is based exclusively on the idea that the amount of productivity they get out of their factories declines as you increase output. So that's what they call diminishing marginal productivity. And the inverse of diminishing marginal productivity effectively is rising marginal cost. So the whole thing comes down to the idea it costs more. As you increase the amount being produced, it costs more to produce that amount, and that's why the price rises.
Right. But that is the opposite of economies of scale, isn't it? Now, I know there are diseconomies of scale when you reach a point, but isn't the idea with economies of scale that the more you produce, that the higher the margin you're going to get? If you're charging the same price at each level, the higher the margin you're going to get.
Well, when they talk about economies of scale, and this is one of the few sensible things in economics, though neoclassicals managed to mangle it up anyway, but economies of scale are the thing where you change the actual scale of operations. So you go from a blast furnace, which is, imagine this is a bit like what physicists will do, assume a spherical cow. Well, I'm going to assume a square, a cubic blast furnace. So if you have a blast furnace, which is 1 cubic metre, that's going to have 6 square metres of steel, because each side of that cube, there are 6 sides, each side is going to be 1 metre by 1 metre, so you've got 1 square metre per side, 6 of them to make up the overall cube. That's 6 square metres, and that 6 square metres can process 1 cubic metre of of stuff at any one time to produce your output. But if you double the size of the cube, you go from 1 metre to 2 metres per side, then you're going to have 4 square metre sides. That's 24 square metres as your area, but the internal area goes to 8. So you have a fourfold increase in your area, and so that tells you how much it costs to produce, how much steel you need to make this cubic blast furnace. But the volume goes from 1 cubic metre to 8 cubic metres, 2 by 2 by 2. And so you get an 8-fold increase in output with a 4-fold increase in the cost, and that's economies of scale. Now, what economists are great at doing, and I'm so sick of them doing it, I'm going to call them out before they bloody well do it to this particular podcast, is if you show something up which demolishes the argument about marginal cost rising, which is a short-term thing where you don't change the scale of operation, you're assuming in that theory that your capital machinery is fixed. You take them on that, they'll throw something about you from economies of scale. They'll do it all the damn time. So bugger off. We're talking about a situation which is just in the short term, where, back to my my cubic blast furnace example, you've got a blast furnace which is one cubic blast furnace where each side of that blast furnace is 1 metre long, and then you're supposed to get diminishing productivity out of that as you add in the production process, as you add more workers to the blast furnace, but, on the outside rather than exactly. Inside, obviously, and more steel. But I'm going to go from that his hypothetical example now to the real world and say we've got to look inside a real world factory to see what actually happens with diminishing marginal product and rising marginal cost, which is what the economists assume happens. But they're wrong. That doesn't happen at all. So where do we start? We give them the basic theory.
Well, do you know what? We will start in the full version of this podcast. Steve does eventually get around to describing exactly why this curve is so completely wrong. To listen, you need to become a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen to hear this in full and all the other podcasts as well. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Back again next week. Thanks for listening.